The most important figure of early Christianity is the Apostle Paul. He is the one who opens the church to non-Jews. Without him, Christianity might still be a sect of Judaism, and the Western world might have continued to worship Jupiter. More after this. The Apostle Paul was a Jew, a Pharisee, who was actually called Saul and not Paul. He changed his name to Paul later when he converted the Roman proconsul Sergius Paulus to Christianity. Paulus was a governor of Cyprus, appointed by the Emperor Claudius. Some scholars argue that Paul became his client. The patron-client relationship is the fundamental building block of Roman society that establishes social hierarchies. Paul changes his name from Saul to Paul in honor of his patron, Paulus. Paul is a Jew. He keeps and promotes Jewish law. According to his own judgment, he is blameless in keeping the law. He was born in the city of Tarsus roughly at the same time as Jesus. Paul tells us that he is a Hebrew from the tribe of Benjamin, and some scholars argue that he is even part of the extended family of Herod the Great. He grew up in a very observant family, and he was sent to Jerusalem to receive his education from Gamaliel the Elder, a famous Jerusalem rabbi whose school was known for exposing their students also to classical Greek literature, philosophy, and ethics. Some scholars argue that Stoic philosophy influences Paul's later writings. It is most likely that Paul is a Roman citizen. Some scholars suggest he is the son of a freedman, a slave who was manumitted by his master. This made the former slave a member of his master's family, and through that he would acquire Roman citizenship. When Paul is arrested, he demands to be sent to Rome to plead his case to the emperor. That request is granted and he is shipped to Rome. He eventually dies by beheading and not by crucifixion. Both are likely privileges of Roman citizenship. Paul is involved in the stoning of Stephen, one of the deacons of the Jerusalem church and the first martyr of the Christian faith. Then Paul travels to Damascus to help persecute the Christian church there. On the way to Damascus, he has a conversion experience. Paul has a vision of Jesus Christ, who commissions him to be an apostle. Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus happens sometimes between 1 and 5 years after Jesus' death. Paul's apostleship is a bit hard to swallow for the disciples who traveled with Jesus through Israel to preach and heal and exorcise demons. Paul was not part of any of this. He was not a follower of Jesus, and he did not know of him before Jesus' death on the cross. The other apostles were personally chosen and commissioned by the still living Christ. The exception is Matthias, who replaced Judas Iscariot and who was chosen by Lot. To convince them that Paul was also a legitimate apostle commissioned by Christ took some convincing, and it always remained a contentious issue. Paul's missionary targets created some extreme conflict. He converted Gentiles, non-Jews. Converting Gentiles gave rise to one of the first and arguably most consequential controversies of early Christianity that had a major impact on world and especially Western history. In the beginning, the church was an entirely Jewish affair, but with Gentile conversion, the question came up: do you have to become a Jew first in order to be a Christian? Do you have to keep the dietary laws, and do converts have to be circumcised? Paul's position was no. James and the Jerusalem church said yes, and Peter's position depended on whom he talked to at the moment. Sometimes he was pro-Gentile inclusion, sometimes he was against it. The question was settled at the Council of Jerusalem in 50 or 51 AD. Paul won. The church admitted Gentiles, but the topic continued to influence Christian controversies for the next 150 years. The Council of Jerusalem opened the floodgates, and soon the Gentiles outnumbered the Jews by such a great margin that Christianity basically became a Gentile movement with some marginal Jews mixed in. Today, we have all but forgotten that the church was Jewish once. Imagine Western history when Christianity would have stayed one sect within Judaism. Western history would have been very different. Maybe Jupiter would still reign supreme. Paul undertook missionary journeys and founded churches in the cities of Asia Minor. Remarkably, the churches that would later become the hearts of the Christian world, Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome, are not among the churches that Paul founded. His churches never reached the prominence of these centers of faith. After he founded a church in one city, he would move on to found another church in the next city. His idea was that this church would be the center, and in time the faith would spread through the countryside until the entire East would be converted. What the content of the Christian faith was very much up for grabs at the time. So there would be other missionaries who visited his congregations after Paul was gone, who would teach them different things than Paul did. Then some of his churches developed some strange theological convictions. To correct them, Paul would write them letters. The surviving letters are the earliest writings in the New Testament. Some of Paul's letters were actually not written by Paul, but by later authors who attributed the letter to him, most likely to make their arguments more viable. The letters Paul actually wrote were also edited later to make them more palatable for ancient Roman sensibilities, because the letters of Paul are actually quite radical. He breaks down many social boundaries when he writes that there is no more Jew or Gentile, male or female, slave or free, but all are one in Christ Jesus. Any notion of equality is a scandal in this world of steep and deeply entrenched hierarchies. Another major idea in his writings is the expectation that the world would end in his lifetime. Procreation, for instance, doesn't make any sense because the world will end. Marriage is entirely for those who have trouble dealing with their hormones. The belief in the immediate return of Jesus seems to have been quite widespread. It is a major disappointment for the Christian movement when it becomes clear that the world will not end, but that life continues and Christianity has to find its place in the context of the empire. If Paul had suspected that his letters would become as influential as they later did, he probably would have been much more careful and clear in what he wrote. But he thought he writes letters to congregations to set their heads straight. The exception is his letters to the churches in Rome. After his work was done in the East, Paul wanted to move on to the western half of the Roman Empire. To raise funds to travel to Spain, he writes his most famous and most theologically influential letter, the letter to the churches in Rome. Churches, plural, not a single church, but several. Whether the letter was successful and he ever got to Spain remains unclear. Some church fathers suggest he did, but we have no writings that tell us about these adventures. Because this is such an important letter for Paul, he employs a professional ghostwriter to help him write it. This is no secret because the man is mentioned in the letter, Tarsus of Iconium. This is common practice for important letters. In Roman culture that says, I'm not scribbling something down for you in between, but you are important, and because you are important, you deserve the most professionally written letter I am able to craft. Tertius does not just write down what Paul tells him. He is no stenographer, but he brings Paul theology in a literary form that conforms to the highest literary standards of the time. Roman culture is a rhetoric culture. Speeches and arguments shape Roman politics, jurisprudence, and history. Every great ancient writer, like for instance Cicero, writes about how to make and develop an argument that will persuade one's listeners or readers. Close analysis of the text by the biblical scholar Robert Jewett revealed that every argument that Paul makes in this letter is built according to the rhetoric structures and principles developed by ancient Roman theoreticians of the craft of persuasion. That makes the letter dense and theology rich. But as always, when it comes to Christian writings of the New Testament, many different theologians have many different opinions what Paul actually meant when he wrote what he wrote. When it comes to Christian writings, nothing is ever clear-cut or easy. And the plain meaning of the text that so many contemporary Christians claim to be guided by is nothing but an interpretation of carefully chosen passages that happen to confirm what people already believe before they even open the book. Paul's letter doesn't travel by mail. It is hand-delivered by a woman named Phoebe, a deacon of the church in Kekris, which is in Corinth. She is a patron of the church. That means this woman holds office in the church and she is rich and influential enough to be a patron. If you want anything in Roman society, you get it through the good graces of your patron and through nothing else. In the year 57 AD, Paul went to Jerusalem to give to the church the last of several donations he had collected for them on his travels. On this occasion, he is accused of bringing Gentiles into the temple, and he escapes lynching only by surrendering himself to the Roman authorities. They keep him for a couple of years. Roman bureaucracy seems to have been even slower than ours. But when they want to hand him over to the Jerusalem authorities, he demands to be sent to Rome to plead his case to the emperor. That's where they sent him, and that's where he meets his end. The exact circumstances of his death are unknown, but tradition has it that Emperor Nero has him beheaded shortly after the Great Fire of Rome, when Nero needs scapegoats to blame for the fire that he possibly lit himself. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I see you in the next video.